And we will, again, there seems to have maybe been an issue with some folks being able to join, but people are now connecting. So we're going to start. This will be recorded, and we will make sure it's available for you as soon as possible after we are done with the webinar today. So welcome to our third in a series of webinars about Postgres. A lot of this content is really geared towards folks that have SQL Server experience because number one, that's what Redgate is known for. That's what a lot of us, our background, our experience has been. For me specifically, I've been able to, make the transition over the last 5, almost 6 years from almost 15 years with Microsoft and SQL Server products. And then because of his job change, I had to move over to Postgres. And even though I had experience with Postgres almost 20 years ago before that, it was a journey. And so what we have been trying to do is provide you the opportunity, that some of the knowledge, the experience that I've gained and others here have gained as we make the transition. So today is not going to be as long of a webinar. I expect this to be about 30 to 40 minutes maximum. And really the goal is to show you how you could, if you're ready to take the next step, get connected to a Postgres database, some good examples of some sample data to help you get started, and go from there. So let's just jump in really quickly. Again, my name is Ryan Booz. I thought this was advancing, but I wasn't on the screen. My name is Ryan Booz. I work for Redgate. I've been here for about 9 months, a long-time Redgate user before that when I was in the SQL Server space. So I've known of the company for a long time, and it's really been a joy to be here and help Redgate through this new journey into Postgres and other multiple database platforms, because it's something we're all being asked to do, is support something more than just our old primary database. And so a little bit about today. This is about getting started with Postgres for SQL Server developers. Next month, I'm actually going to be away. And so Grant Fritchie, who a lot of you probably know, he's going to give his view of really how he's learned over the last year and a half or so to get started with Postgres. Again, he comes from a deep knowledge of query tuning and SQL Server, has a number of books to his name, really a great community resource. And so he's going to share his journey towards Postgres as something new to learn and understand. And then I'll be back in August, and we're going to talk about extensions. It's something that we've mentioned in the first 2 webinars. I'm going to briefly show you extensions at the end of this webinar, but then to hopefully allow you to see the breadth and the power of extensions within Postgres, we're going to review what my top 10 are. Now, there are hundreds of these, and it's a lot of good discussion, debate over what the most useful or what the top 10 are, but there are a few that are really common among developers, and so it's good for you to know about. Couple reminders: this session is being recorded, and so if you just enjoy, you don't have to think about writing stuff down. You can go back and watch it later. And then as we go and you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. What will happen is at the end, I'm going to just give you again an update on what's coming in the future, both with these webinars and with PASS Summit in November. And as I'm doing that, the team will collate the questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And if we can't get to some of them, what we did for the last webinar is we actually created a video, and we're starting to put that out to answer as many of them as possible. So it's actually on our YouTube channel, and you'll start to see it probably in some follow-up emails, just to do as much of that as we can to make sure that we're getting through the questions that we need to. So the agenda for today, hopefully, is pretty straightforward. There will be a handful of slides, and then I'm going to show you how to connect to get a database, create a database, restore a database, and connect to it. Hopefully give you a sense of this isn't too scary, and a lot of what you know will help you into that next transition. So accessing Postgres, ways that you can do it, how to actually get connected, some sample databases you can use. We're going to then restore 1 or 2 databases pretty quickly, just to show you what you can do and how it can work. We'll run a query, and then I do want to show you extensions again, because I've made such a big deal of them, and I just want you to understand what the opportunities may be, particularly if you're a hosted user, if you happen to use Postgres in an environment like AWS or Azure PostgreSQL or whatever that might be. All right, so let's talk about accessing Postgres. So there are a number of ways that you right now can pretty easily, with fairly minimal effort, get Postgres set up on your local laptop and begin playing around, seeing what this looks like. So first and foremost, Docker is just a great first way to start. Postgres has been, in my estimation, has been a little bit on the forefront of being a containerized database. Many of the services that you might use right now are all run as Dockerized or service, container services at some level. SQL Server is there. We can use Docker containers. There's the ability to use that as a production environment is just, taking time to understand the nuances of that. But whether you're on Mac or Windows, you can use Docker, and with a command, which I'll show you in a second, you can simply pull the main image and start it with one command and then connect with whatever app. And I will show you a couple of the apps that will allow you to connect. Another really good option if you're on Mac is this tool called Postgres.app. So this is actually kind of a Dockerized version. It's actually not Docker, so I don't want to say that it is Docker, but it's an environment that they maintain. And this is from the team that actually sells an IDE for Mac called Postigo. And so you can install this. It's a native Mac app. Once you start it, you have access to multiple versions of Postgres. It gives you native access to tools that we're going to show you today, pSQL and pgrestore and pgdump. All of those are included, and then it will be updated over time. So if you're on Mac, honestly, this is a pretty good option to not have to worry about some nuances that are happening under the cover. So it used to be that the version of Postgres that was installed with Mac got a little bit hard to deal with if you were installing Homebrew or some of those things. So I really recommend this as a good alternative if you are using a Mac. And then directly on Linux, it's a really easy, fast way, quite honestly, to get connected to Postgres. There's wide support in the packages, whatever version of Linux you're using, whether it's apt or yum, you can install those packages with one or two commands and have a running Postgres server very, very quickly. The one thing I'll mention is this. I'm on a Windows machine right now. Windows has come a long way when it comes to some of the support. So Windows installers do work. If you go to the postgres.org website, you will find links to a Windows installer. And they work pretty well. We actually use them internally for some demos. It will do what you expect it to do. And there's a lot of good development happening on Windows. However, I will simply say that across the maintainers of Postgres and across the more global community, Windows is not well used or widely used within the community. And so there have over the years been some nuances, and a lot of that has to do with the developers just don't use Windows natively to do the development. It doesn't mean it's not a viable option, but quite honestly, anywhere you would spin up a Postgres instance, whether it's in the cloud, RDS, whatever it might be, those are all going to run on some kind of Linux machine. And so using something like Docker, which would be a Linux container, would just be a good way to go. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm simply saying that it's not going to be as widely used across the community. And that might come with some just support issues. It just takes a little bit longer to get to a solution sometimes. The community is really good about support. I'm not trying to say it's not. Just I always feel it's necessary to throw that out there. The other option you have, and I'm going to flip over in a second and show you all of these, is obviously some kind of database as a service hosting option. So all of us know that AWS, Azure, and Google have some kind of hosted Postgres solution. So if you happen to be an Azure user and you have some kind of credits, maybe you are an MVP or you have some kind of licensing that provides credits to Azure, that's a great way to get started. All of these usually have some tier of free service for some period of time. And so that's certainly possible. You can spin up whether it's Aurora, RDS, Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres, whatever it might be. That's a very viable option, and they're great solutions. Other options that are kind of new in the last couple of years, all of these companies I personally know and have worked with, and I think they have some really good solutions, even for a hobby user. And so I'll show you in a second. One is neon.tech. So this is Neon database. It is fully Postgres. What they are doing is they are attempting and doing a really good job at it, providing an RDS-like experience that is open source. And so you could, if you wanted, install your own Neon database layer. And so you would get full availability and scalability and so forth. They have a free tier. It's very easy to get started with basically one or two commands, and then you have a running Postgres database you can connect to and start working with. Crunchy Data is a company. They have a product called Crunchy Bridge. They have a hobby tier. And so if you spend $5 or less, so if you spin it up on the weekends, do some work and shut the machine off, If your bill is less than $5 a month, you just won't get billed. And so that's how they treat their hobby layer. I think if you let it run all month, it's $10 a month. So a good option. And the great thing about Crunchy, a lot of the people in that company, Crunchy Data, are heavily invested in Postgres, a lot of core committers there. Just a good company, and they're really working hard to make a very good online Postgres hosted option. And last but not least is Ivan. Ivan is a infrastructure as a company, as an infrastructure as a service company. And so they do have a Postgres tier, also a free tier that you can sign up for kind of a hobby layer just to understand how Postgres works. And last but not least, we have the Postgres Playground, which is provided by Crunchy. They released this maybe in spring of last year, and it's actually Postgres in the browser. So it downloads what we call WASM runtime into your browser. It's actually Postgres, and they have different data sets that you can use to learn. So just let me quickly run through a couple of these with you so that you can see what I'm talking about. Number one, we have the official Docker image. There's a lot of good information on here, exactly of how to use it, the command to run. The nice thing about it, if you actually do a search for Postgres official image, you will end up, and we'll make sure these links are in the deck when we share. There's a great little article written last year on the Docker website about how to use Postgres, the official Docker image. And so a lot of what you would need to do is shown here, even ways to customize that image with Docker files and so forth, if you are comfortable with that. But honestly, even if you just have Docker desktop, with one Docker command, you can pull and run a Postgres server very quickly, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to worry about managing in Docker files and so forth. You really can do this very easily if you have Docker or Docker Desktop installed. This is Postgres app. Again, this is the downloadable Mac one. I just wanted you to see the website. Again, this is maintained by the people that sell Postago, which is a really nice Mac IDE for Postgres. Neon, great little website. And the nice thing here is you simply can sign in with something like your Google account. They have a couple other single sign-in accounts. And that's how you can sign up, and you can select the free tier, and you can have, I think, up to 3 databases with a couple gigs of data. Very, very fast and easy to get started. And if you're using a native tool like PSQL, they actually have a way that you get a URL, and that simply logs you into your database. So they've done a great job on user experience trying to make that happen. Crunchy Data, you'll know them by the hippo. That is their logo. And so anywhere you see Crunchy, you'll see them in a lot of developer conferences. They have a product. So if you go to the products tab, they have a product called Crunchy Bridge. And so you can sign up. I actually did this the other day. I had not signed up with my personal account in quite a while. Within 2 minutes, I got a text from one of the managers of this product whom I know, and very fast and easy to get started. So I would recommend it. And again, they have this hobby tier, and if you spend $5 or less a month, it ends up being free. And finally, Ivan. So Ivan has a lot of solutions, but they've invested a lot in Postgres, and so you can start with a free tier as well. And then the last is the Crunchy Data Postgres Playground. And so you can see it, I'm simply in a browser tab. And now this is PSQL, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But if I do something like list, it will show me all the databases in this current runtime. And so I happen to be in the Postgres database, and I can see that there's nothing in here. It's an empty database, and I could start by creating a table or doing something there. They also have tutorials that you can select and do everything in your browser. Now, this does download a couple hundred megabytes because it's a full runtime. If you download the data for each of these tutorials, it will take a little bit of time. But it's pretty cool. It's an easy way to learn how to use Postgres. All right, now, of course, Zoom is getting my way up here. And we'll come back to that in just a second. So that's a few ways you can get started. What I'm going to show you today in just a few more minutes is running locally for me on Docker. And the reason I do that is I can start up many Docker images, many different versions of Postgres. I can customize each Docker image, and I'm not the most advanced Docker user in the world. I have learned it over the years because I've needed to. But just having a little bit of knowledge of how to do a Docker start, Docker pull, you can very quickly get one running and get started with it. And there's a lot of help online of how to do that. So I will show you how I got it running, but that's what I'm doing locally. Anything I show you today could be done with any of these options. So now we're going to talk connecting to Postgres. So if you were at one of the previous sessions, I've shown this slide before. It's one I keep in almost every deck I talk about Postgres for new users. As a SQL Server developer, I would say that is one of the things that frustrated me the most coming to Postgres, because I am so used to a really great graphical tool in SQL Server Management Studio. And I'll just say straight out of the gate, there is nothing that's comparable. There are some things that are really close, and part of that's because of the open source nature of Postgres. There is, Microsoft owns SQL Server, Microsoft owns the tooling, and they can make a really good experience. Even Azure Data Studio has got a lot of investment for SQL Server. Whether or not it's a tool you prefer, they've done a lot with it to make it a valuable and useful tool, and even some features that aren't in SSMS. For me personally, I have grown to like dbeaver. It is an open source tool. There is a community version that is free. They do have paid for versions that have some additional features, and it supports multiple platforms, not just Postgres. It supports tens of databases at least. SQL Server, you can connect to MySQL, you can connect to MongoDB and other things. So there's a lot of support there. Again, it's not perfect. It is based on Eclipse, and so often that causes people to run away. In years past, with other tools I've used based on Eclipse, I usually had memory issues, things locked up. It just hasn't been my experience. I get paid nothing from dbeaver. It's just a tool that I have grown to just appreciate because it has the features I need to demo the stuff I need to do. Azure Data Studio is in the upper right. DataGrip, a lot of people love DataGrip. It is a good tool, but it's a for-fee tool, and so I just don't have a license, and I generally don't use it. But there's a lot of good value there too. So if you have JetBrains tools, please consider it. And then there's logos of everything. Now, the one logo that's here that I have kind of is my little controller has gone to sleep. Are we gonna? Okay, here we go. There we are. pgadmin is a tool that I just don't prefer to use. I mean, no harm to pgadmin. It is an installed tool. It's a web-based application that they have basically made into a desktop app. And there is a lot of inherent value because it's been developed over the years with one of the companies that supports Postgres. It's just not my preference. It doesn't mean it's bad, but there are other options. If you do try and use it and something is just a little bit off or it doesn't quite click with you, explore one of these other options and see what might happen. Now, I cared so much about this that a few years ago, I blogged about this. So when I was first coming over to Postgres, actually, I was so frustrated by this, I ended up writing this blog. The tooling stinks, and I wanted to use another word other than stinks, but I didn't. I'd probably been using Postgres about a year at this point, and I was pretty frustrated because I was trying to teach a group of younger developers who were used to SQL Server and had been now asked to move over to Postgres. And so they too were very used to the graphical tools. I was trying to find a good option. And what was interesting is that one of the responses I got is from someone I know in the .NET space. His name is Rob Connery, and has a great learning resource on Postgres. He has other learning resources. You may have heard of him. He has done stuff with Scott Hanselman in the past. And so he actually gave this response. This was back in 2019, I think, really in response to my post. And I was a little bit surprised by that. And at the end, he kept saying, you just need to learn the command line. And I didn't want to, I didn't want to go there. I kept saying, but you don't understand. I have these junior developers and they're so used to all these other IDEs. I would simply say that 5 years after that, 4.5 years after that, I agree with Rob. And I didn't understand at the time. So pSQL is the installed tool. You're going to see me use it in just a couple of minutes. And it's just the tool that's been created. It's kind of like SSMS for Postgres. It's just that it's a command line tool. It has been developed for more than 30 years to work with Postgres, the various commands, things that are inherent to pSQL. It understands the various versions of Postgres. So if you try and run a command that doesn't work on an older version, some of those things, they have version and so forth. So it is a really useful tool. It comes installed anytime you install Postgres locally, whether you use the Postgres app, you could even use it directly out of Docker, or you can install it inside of Linux. You can install it on Windows. It's really easy to get it installed. And I'll show you a blog post in just a second that I wrote up to help you do that. But it really is the go-to. I would say if you're going to start to use Postgres, I highly recommend that you start to look at pSQL, think about how it might be a useful tool in your tool belt. So the first link on this slide goes to our Simple Talk website, and I apologize, Zoom pop-up keeps getting in my way. And so one of the articles on there I wrote recently is how to get started with pSQL, and just a little ways down. So I'll go to the top. Here's the article on Simple Talk. A little brief history of what it is, why you should use it, and then we get into installing. So how to install it on Linux, how to install it on Windows, Mac OS, and so forth. A lot of ways that you can use pSQL. I definitely recommend you look at it. And then there's a second article that's linked from there, which gives you, in my view, some of the first commands. We call them meta commands within pSQL to help you get started. And so give those articles a look. The second link on here is to someone who, Letitia, is a Postgres advocate out of France, works for EDB. She has a really great website that just has hundreds of pSQL tips on how to use pSQL. So you can go look at that. So now let's talk about sample databases. And this is what we're going to use really quickly today, just to give you an idea of how you can get started. So we've talked about how you can get started with Postgres, whether you install it locally or using one of those free services, or one I didn't mention if you happen to know of another one. We've talked about tools. So use something that might help you get familiar with Postgres, whether it's command line pSQL, any one of those graphical tools. If you already use Azure Data Studio, install the Postgres extension, the add-in, and you can connect to a Postgres database. If you're comfortable with that tool, go for it. And the nice thing about even Azure Data Studio is you can use database notebooks, Postgres. The Pagela database has kind of become one of the standards. Now, this is a port of the MySQL Scala database, which is a DVD rental store database. So the community has kept this up. As new features come available, they will modify the schema to include different data types, indexes, and so forth. It's not very big, but it is a good way to start simply for this one reason. And one of the reasons I tend to use it is a lot of tutorials online that mention Postgres use this schema. And so you'll see store and all of, actors and films, you'll see those same tables and you can run those same queries. So that's one of the reasons I tend to use it. It's not very big. And it's actually something I'm trying to work on with some folks to maybe get a bigger sample with some newer features, but it's a good place to start. I'm going to show you that one in just a minute. Microsoft, back in 2016, actually did release a version of Wide World importers for Postgres. It's not fully complete, but it has all the schemas, the tables, and the ability to insert some data with the workload generator. So not all of the features are there, but if you are used to the Wide World importers, there is an example that you can use, and it has the same namings mostly across the board. And then Postgres Air is another one that I tend to reference. This is by a Postgres committer and great community user, Hedy Dombrovskaya. She's actually in Chicago, and she has a book about Postgres query tuning, and this is the database that she uses in that book. And so it's a great book, and I also recommend people look at it. It has a lot of data generation tools and so forth. She and her husband and some others who have written this book trying to keep this data updated every year or so to move dates forward and so forth. All right, so now I've gone and gotten two of those databases. So I want to show you pretty quickly how to create a database in Postgres now that I have it running, and how to restore each of those, because that is probably one of the things you're going to do first. Again, if you've never heard me talk about my transition, let me simply say this to Postgres. I was a SQL Server developer, .NET developer, manager, program manager for 15 plus years. I moved companies thinking I was going to be using SQL Server and data warehousing. And when I showed up at this new company, after I'd signed the contract, left my job, the first day I got a connection string to Postgres, not SQL Server, and I was slightly confused. And one of the first things that I wanted to do when I realized this was my new reality was get a copy of our development database and restore it locally. And it was a challenge. And so I wanted to talk to you quickly and then show you how to restore that database. We've talked briefly about this in the previous webinar, and there's lots of resources that go a little bit deeper than this, but there's 3 slides just to help you understand what we're about to do. Number 1, backups or dumps. This is a long-standing discussion within the Postgres community. Is pgdump a backup tool? Well, It is. It's not a continuous backup tool, right? This is not the tool that we use. But if I have access to a database and I want to get a copy of just that database locally, the easiest way to do that is with pgdump. Many things you'll find online as backups for you to restore are created with pgdump. And there are essentially two formats. One is just the script version format, which I'll show you in a second. It literally outputs a SQL file with every command needed to recreate the schema and recreate the data, indexes, and everything. So you can open it, you can look at it. That can be really helpful. The other reason that's helpful is if you happen to be going between versions of Postgres, or maybe you're going to a different flavor of Postgres that might not support all of the dump options in the binary version. So you can see the SQL, or you can take parts out, you can modify it. So there is a value in doing the file format, but it's a file and so it's text, and so it's pretty large. The other way is what we call directory or custom formats. These are binary at some level. They have some compression to them. That you cannot view them natively, and they can only be restored with the pgrestore tool. And so pgdump gets the data out, pgrestore puts the data in. However, pgrestore is not used for the script text version format. It's just a SQL file. And so you simply take that file format and just pipe it into pSQL, or you open it up in an IDE and you run the script. So you do have to create a database to restore a database. So this is a unique thing within Postgres when you come from SQL Server. Most of the time, we are used to opening SSMS or Azure Data Studio and saying restore, and we can even reference a new database, and SQL Server, the tooling, will create the new database and restore into that new database. That's not exactly how Postgres works. When you do the backup, you actually get all of the commands to recreate that database, including the database name. And so you do essentially have to create a new empty database every time you want to restore a copy for you to work with, right? Because it's simply running commands to update and get that database into the current state. If there's existing data, if you don't have an empty database or you don't have the database that you want created, you're not going to get the results you expect. And so the first thing, and we talked about this in the first webinar, we need to create a database. By default, it will use the template1 database. And so if I simply say create database mydb, I'll get that database, and it is based off of the template1 database every Postgres server has by default. So once I create that database, I can use pgrestore or pSQL. So we're going to show both of those. If it is an actual dump file in a custom format or a directory format, I can restore it using various switches, and that will actually take that data and put it back into the database I reference. The big thing here is if you read the documentation, as a SQL Server user, I thought -- create would create the database that I'm referencing. That's not how pgrestore works. So in Postgres, when you connect, you are always connecting to a database. You don't just connect to the server and then connect to the database. The connection string must always reference a database. And so the -D option, which you see down here, let me get my little highlighter. The -D option is not restore to that database. It is connect to that database to get my connection set, and then run the restore. Now, if that database exists and it's empty, then it will actually restore to that database as long as you don't use the create command. If you use the create command, however, you're saying, hey, Postgres, when you run this restore, there is a database name in that backup file. Create that database first and then restore to it. Use this database as the one to connect to just so I can do all the other work. So it can be confusing. Here's my high level to get past all of that. Anytime you use pgrestore or pSQL, create an empty database first, use that in your connection string, and then it will simply restore into that new empty database, and everyone will be happy. All right, so let's go ahead and show you how that works. So I am in pSQL. So I just want to first show you a couple of these examples. So this is the Pagila database I talked about. That's how I say it. I'm not sure if that's the official way to say it, but Pagila it is for me. Maybe it's Pagila. Anyway, the Pagila database, and you can see that it really was simply dumped using Postgres dump. All right, so it was done by beta version 15 beta 2. So the person who dumped this file had that version of Postgres on their system that they were using, and they ran pgdump and a set of commands to a textual file. And this is what we got. It looks just like SQL, alter schema, create domains, create types, create tables, functions. So we could read through this, and they, in this case, they just dumped the schema separately, which you can do. We're not going to have time to get into that today. And then separately, they dumped the data. And so again, this looks very similar. It is a SQL file. It's simply individual SQL statements. This version has the copy statement, and we talked about this briefly in the second webinar. Copy is Postgres's specific, almost like a bulk load tool. It's been around for more than 30 years. It's a fast and efficient way to get data into a table. And so this simply says, hey, until you see the line ending command, copy the incoming standard in data, what you see next, into this table, and it has to be in the right format. Alternately, you can tell pgdump to simply dump individual statements. And so if you go to that URL, you'll find both of these files, and both of them can be used. You only need to choose one, but both of them can be used to load the data. And so what I am going to show you now, in dbeaver, I'm going to show you two options. For the Pagila database, I want to show you the command line with pSQL because it actually is fairly quick and easy to get started. I have these exact same files here, so I'm not going to do anything unique or different. You've seen those files. I'm going to say pSQL. I have that installed. There's a couple ways we could do this. We have to at least tell it what host we want to go to, what user we want to use. Again, by default, it is the Postgres user. And then what database we want to connect to. So in this case, I don't have another, I'm going to create the database first. So I could do that here. And if I just simply do that, it's going to prompt me for my password. And now that I'm here, this is what we call a meta command. So I can say, and this is referenced in the article on the Simple Talk website that I mentioned earlier. I can say /L, that means list all the databases on this specific instance of Postgres. I can connect to a different database by doing /C and say admin code, and I just use tab to autocomplete. So there's a lot of ways to do that. I'm going to go back to Postgres. That's kind of the default database. We don't tend to use it for much. And this is a little trick that the bang symbol allows me to run essentially a Unix command to clear the screen. So I'm going to say create database PG101 Pagila. All right, that database is created. If I say /L, you'll now see that it is, in fact, there, PG101 Pagila. Now, I'm going to go out of here. There are ways I could do this, but it's easier to do it from the command line. And I'm going to say this was a textual file. So those files are inside of a folder here. I'm simply going to say pSQL. And I'm going to do the same thing. And in this case, I'm going to reference that file. So -F, if you happen to be a command line user, you can also do the backwards arrow to pipe data in. But I'm saying, hey, there's a file in here that I want. It's in the Pagila folder, and it's Pagila schema. All right, so that is the file that will create the schema for me. It's going to ask for my password. Oops, I didn't type in the right password. And there you go. It is simply running all of this data. And so if I go back to, so I can log back in, and I can now say, hey, let me look at that Pagila, PG101 Pagila. And D will list all the tables. Something. It's exactly what you want during a demo. Oh, interesting. Okay, I didn't expect that. I must have had some, maybe I already, oh, you know what? I bet I already had that. I had the wrong database, so that is my bad. So let's go over to dbeaver. We can say refresh. We see Pagila 101. And this is where it starts to look a little bit more like SSMS. All right, so I am not 100% sure what I just did, and maybe I picked the wrong file. And there's, yeah, okay, so already exists. What did I do? I sincerely apologize. Oh, I know what's happened. And why this didn't happen before, I'm not fully certain. I'm not going to belabor this point. I have, oh my goodness. Okay, in case anyone can't tell what's happened, here's exactly what's happened. This is a great example that I intended to do second, and I'm doing now. Notice that I didn't reference a database. And so by default, PSQL will only go to the database that it will connect to by default. And by default, PSQL connects to whatever user you are using. So there is a Postgres database. It created all of that data in the Postgres database. That was my fault. I should have copied the commands I have up here on my other screen, but I thought I could be quicker. So in this case, I'll say database PG101 Vegila, and now we should be happy. There we go. I'd obviously made that mistake one other time, and so that's why that was there. So now if I simply go back, and I can say -d PG101 Vegila, and sure enough, I have all of my tables in this database. So again, I could do any of this. I could do the exact same thing from dbeaver. I could have taken this schema script or Azure Data. I could run this whole script. I'd get the exact same results. PSQL just lets me reference that file. So in this case, I'm going to use the copy command. And the reason is this. If I were to show you the insert one, if I were to run this, you would see it would probably take about 20 seconds because it's running individual transactions for every statement. The copy command is a faster version. So whether I run it here or I run it in my over here, so I'm in PSQL, so I'm going to go to that master. I'm going to say Vegila data, and this is the copy version, the one that's going to use the copy command, and you'll see that it is much faster. And so in a matter of about 3 or 4 seconds, I get all of that data in. It creates many partitions and so forth. The insert version would just take probably about 3 or 4 times as long because it's doing all those individual transactions. That's the difference between the two and something you're used to even with SQL Server. Now, let me show you. So that gets the Vegila database. Let me go ahead and we'll go ahead and finally refresh that now that we have the data in the right place. And I can go to the public tables. You'll see I have all my tables, and we should be able to see some data. Now, I'm going to do something here, and this is one area that a lot of folks get confused on with dbeaver specifically. I have a query window open. You can get a query window up here under the SQL dropdown. You can right-click on a database and set new SQL window if you want. If you do it this way, it will select the correct database. However, if you're reusing, you'll notice up here there are connections. And I'll highlight that for you really quickly just so we're on the same page. So this is where your connection is shown. And so I do have to switch to the database I want. In this case, it's PG101, and I have to select the schema I want to start with. Once I have that, I can run it from here, or I can, in this case, Control-Enter is the shortcut, kind of like we're used to F5, and that will do the same thing. All right, so we have a database, we have data. It really was 2 commands, and it's all SQL scripts. So as long as you get access to a Postgres database, you can run those 2 scripts, get data, and start to follow examples online. Now, the second example I want to show you is with the wide world importers. It'll be one of the last things we do. I'm going to use dbeaver for all of this. Again, most of this should work the same, whether you're using Azure Data Studio, even pgadmin, whatever it might be. I'm simply going to say create new database, PG101, and we'll say WWI, Wide World Importers. I'm not going to change anything else right now. I'm just going to let it do that. It gets me a database over here, which I can right-click on, and under Tools, I can say Restore. So the Wide World Importers version is actually a dump file. It's a custom format dump file, and so I can't use PSQL for it. I must use the PG Restore. And I was going to show you a couple things that I've seen. So actually, really quickly, let me come back over here. So if I have PG restore, this happens to a lot of folks who are first using Postgres, particularly coming from SQL Server. If you notice, one of the things that is in those textual files, and it happens in the custom files as well, is it actually does things like set ownership on objects. And so if I give you a backup file from my local cluster, my server, and I have a user that you don't have that might own a table, it is still going to, by default, unless I set it up correctly, unless I dump it without that information, it's going to try and alter the database with those same users. And you're going to get a lot of errors that say, hey, that user doesn't exist. So if I say pg restore localhost users Postgres, the file format is custom, and I'm not going to do anything else. I'm simply going to say that is the dump file. It's going to ask for a, oops, sorry. Make it to, there we go. Oh, I had the crate. I apologize. So if you do this by default, what's going to happen, and the database we're going to connect to is, I just create that new one, PG101, and we said WWI. It's going to ask for my password. And a lot of people see this often. And so I get this question when folks are moving over. They say, hey, I got this backup file, and I'm getting these errors. What does this mean? Well, actually, all of the create statements have worked. You're simply getting these errors because as part of the create statement, there's also the alter table statement to set owner. I don't have Greg Lowe as an owner in my database. So there are a couple ways to do this. The person who created this, which I assume was Greg, could have dumped and excluded ownership commands. All right. And then whoever runs those statements becomes the owner. It's a different discussion for a different day. The other opportunity, and I'm going to simply do this very quickly. This will be the last thing I'll show you. So we're going to get in here. I'm going to drop database PG 101. And get rid of it. If I create that database again, and then I get out and I run this command, but I do it with no owner, that says, hey, PG restore, don't run the alter ownership command. You'll notice that this does a lot better. I get many fewer errors. And so that's another way to get to this. If you're following examples online and you get all those errors, they're not actually errors. It's just saying, well, I created the table. I got everything in there, but then I tried to change the owner and this owner doesn't exist. A couple ways to go about it. Just want to show that to you. In dbeaver, this will work. Since I've already restored it, I won't go through this. There is a restore dialog. You might be more comfortable with that. Notice there is this discard object owners checkbox. That is the same thing as -- no owner. So I'd recommend you do that. Otherwise, you'll end up with what looks like many, many errors, and you'll be a little bit frustrated. So now that that has actually happened, we're going to come over to this. I'm going to change this database to that. And now you'll notice there is a little issue here. I don't see all of the schemas. I have to update schemas here. And now I see all of the schemas now that I've actually created it under the covers. So to check that the data did actually work, I can run this command. I can say instead of countries, let's say people. All right, so you'll see that dbeaver is nice in doing some work in autocomplete for us. So those are the basics. That's how you can get Postgres going. A couple tools you can use, whether you have a textual dump file or a what we call custom or directory file format dump file. You can restore that with dbeaver or with pSQL or with another graphical tool. And then the last thing I was going to show you is simply some quick, simple commands. Now you see that I just simply wrote select star from. We're really used to that. Most of what you know, and this is my point in the first two sessions, most of what you know from SQL Server will work at some level within Postgres. It's SQL. It's when you use T-SQL that you'll start to have issues, right? So T-SQL is the SQL Server version. And so things like top is not a command in standard ANSI SQL. So if I am, let me get back over to my Pagila database. If I select this, we're good to go. But if I say something like select top one, I'm going to get an error because that doesn't work. Instead, we have to do something like limit one. And now I get one row from that result set. So a lot of what you know, group bys, things like that, all work. I can do, again, in dbeaver, this works like SQL Server. If I select text, I can run just that text. Now, again, I am always doing Control-Enter because that's the shortcut, like F5. Or I could do this little play button to execute the highlighted SQL statement. And so there we get that statement. Now, Postgres is very much a standard database when it comes to kind of the ANSI standards. So the semicolon does indicate the end of a statement. dbeaver understands that. And so I don't have to highlight things. As long as they have that semicolon, I can just say Control-Enter, and it will get me that data. Now, this looks different because you'll notice, since I didn't highlight text, I also have explain. We talked really briefly at the end of the last session about explain. This is what query plans look like by default in Postgres. This is the actual query plan. I can see how many pages were hit, and then I can take this, use some online tools, some other features, even some things like SQL Monitor from Redgate to see what a query plan looks like in a more graphical format. So pretty quickly out of the gate, you should be able to get access to Postgres either locally or at your in a host environment, restore any one of these samples without too much hassle using a graphical tool or something like pgrestore. And then it's a matter of connecting to it and starting to run some commands. So that is the basics of what we have for today. Let me, we ran our first things. Oh, that's right. I did want to quickly talk about extensions. And so this will be the last thing, take me 1 minute. So we talked about this, extensions are installed on the server. There's actually code. It's kind of like, the CLI extensions that we could write with SQL Server. They're installed on the server. You'll have access to many of them simply because Postgres installs some of them for you to use as part of the default server. If you happen to be in a database as a service environment, they don't support all of them. You have to work with them. And again, it's per database. And what that means is this. I can see all of the extensions that are available to me to use within my database. Now, depending on my privileges, some of them might not work. So the very quick and first example I want to use is pgstat statements. Referenced this in the last webinar. A lot of good references online. We've recently done some blogging about it, both at Simple Talk and just as a community. There are some recent new ideas with pgstat statements. So this is an extension. By default, this does not exist in a Postgres database, but the extension is available by nature of it being Postgres. It's installed with the server. And so I can go to my Postgres database. I'll use Pagila as an example. And I can say select star from PG available extensions. And I'll get a list of all the extensions that are available. I can order by name. And you can scroll down and see which ones. This third column is the installed version column. So are any installed in this database? We'll see that the language PL/PG/SQL is installed, and that is it. However, there is an extension called pgstat statements. It's available, and it's at version 1.0. And so if I want access, and that gets, what that does in this case, it gets me a view to statistics about the queries that have been run on my server. So if I say select stars and pgstat statements, you'll see that says I don't have that. But if I create extension pgstat statements, now I can run that command because that extension has been installed into this database. It gives me access to that view, which shows me the various statistics for the queries that are being run on this database. There's a lot more to be said about extensions, and we're going to talk about that in August, and that's why this was a teaser. So I am done with stuff of the day. Please put your questions in. We have not quite 10 minutes or so to run through them. As those questions are being fed, if there are any, I want to talk quickly about next month. Again, Grant will be here to talk about his journey learning Postgres. Remember that the community Past Data Summit is coming up in November. Early bird pricing ends at the end of July, and there's a lot of announcements coming in about 2 weeks, schedule and other things, and sessions that have been selected. And there's going to be about, I don't know, 12 to 15 Postgres-specific sessions that will help you further your journey in this new database. A couple of them, we have some pre-cons. Grant and I and a few others here at Redgate are going to be talking about monitoring your database, both SQL Server, Postgres, and others. And so we're going to have a lot of nuances between SQL Server and Postgres. Ryan Lambert, as I mentioned before, he is a SQL Server DBA by day, but he's loved geospatial data for a long time. He's an expert in PostGIS and Postgres. He's giving a full day pre-con on geospatial data with Postgres. Really cool. I'd encourage you to check that out. We've already announced our learning pathway. These 5 sessions are meant to help you get, again, started in the basics. The first one is a little bit more in depth than what I've shown you today, but it will cover a lot of those things with a few more details that I couldn't get to in this time, and keep going through there. So getting to questions, is a public schema the default schema? And oh, yes. So the public schema in Postgres is essentially a default schema. It is available everywhere, and it can't be deleted. Now, you can revoke permissions to it. I actually have a 3-part article on Simple Talk about just permissions and schema within Postgres, and we talk a lot about the public schema. So I would encourage you to look at it. Mostly, the mandate in the community is try not to use the public schema for your stuff. Create your own schemas, because the public schema is what the Postgres developers use for functions and so forth. Will there be a webinar about Postgres schemas best practices? That's a great question. We are looking to do more of these beyond the few that we have scheduled through September. That's a great question, and one we could probably cover in more depth on the schema and permissions side of things. There are good best practices there. I do have, again, those articles you could start to look at. I've given a talk a few times, which you can find on my YouTube channel or elsewhere at conferences about user permissions, and a lot of that is tied to schema. So give that a look. But thanks for that question. Something we can definitely look at. Is database name linked to the underlying objects? So logic files. A great question. So the question basically is, if I have a database named Pagila, are the files underneath named Pagila? So there is a PG data folder, and each database will have its own set of files, yes, that you can identify. However, moving a database, when you actually move an entire database, you can only do it because it shares the wall directory, the wall file, which is our logging. It's actually shared among the cluster, and so you can't just take one set of files individually. That's what PG dump and so forth is. And so is back and restore one of the recommended ways of how to rename a database? It absolutely is one way to do it. Again, dump is a transactionally consistent operation. So when you run dump, that whatever the state, so it begins a transaction, you get the state of the data at the beginning of that transaction. So if it runs for an hour, you're missing all the changes that have come in for the last hour, because its snapshot by default is that first hour, wherever you took it. And so it's not a backup per se, but it is a good way to dump a database, particularly if you know that you can get back to some state. There are other ways and methods of getting a database, but yeah, quite honestly, it's probably the easiest way to get a whole new copy of a database over to a new name. You can rename a database if you need to, just like you could in SQL Server. It will lock the database, and you have those issues, but there are other ways to make that happen. Great question. How do I join two tables from 2 different databases? Oh, I love this question. Thank you so much. You can't. How about that? This is another area where it is a uniqueness of Postgres, in that Postgres running as the cluster is the database. We call it a cluster, is the server. The individual databases, remember, when I connect to Postgres, that connection string must include a database. I have to have a database to actually connect to. And one of the things that Postgres has never allowed is this idea of breaking out of the context of that database in the midst of a query to connect to two databases. In SQL Server, we're used to being able to reference other databases on that instance. You can't do that in Postgres. The best you can do is to use something like a foreign data wrapper to create external tables to a different database on that server. Postgres FDW is an extension. It is provided by default. You should have access to it anywhere you want. And you basically install that extension and you create an external table, which you can then join on to get other data across multiple databases. That is your current only option right now. There are a couple things like that. I don't want to say it's your only option, but there is no way within a query to do some kind of, reference to a table, another database. How do you pronounce, next question, how do you pronounce Postgres? So I did cover this in the first one. That's a great question because it is so, something we cover often within the community. There's history to it. There are two, ways that the community says are officially supported or condoned. One is just simply Postgres without the QL on the end. The other one is as one word. It is not PostgreSQL. It is PostgreSQL. And the reason is Postgres was the earlier version of what we know today. It meant after post ingress. Ingress was the previous database from the 80s, or actually from the 70s. And so Postgres means post ingress. And then in 1995, when they open sourced it, they supported the SQL language. They added the QL to try and signify that we're now supporting standard SQL. And so it's PostgreSQL. It is not PostgreSQL. It's not PostgreSQL. It is Postgres or PostgreSQL. Two more questions, and I think we'll be at time. Are there tools that will help migrate procedures from SQL Server to Postgres? Very good questions coming today. Thank you so much. No. There are some. All of the major cloud vendors have some kind of tooling to help you get pretty far. Schema, tables, data, functions, and procedures at some level. There are just features within SQL Server that do not translate to Postgres, and it will require manual intervention. There's just no magic bullet yet. And so maybe that's another good webinar we could run a little bit later, is some details about the differences within, Postgres procedures, the language PL/PG/SQL, as opposed to T-SQL, which is what you're using in SQL Server procedures. There is no magic bullet, but I would encourage you to look. Again, I know AWS has a pretty good one called Data Migration Framework, something to that nature. It should be easy to find. It will probably get you a lot of the way, but you are going to have some manual intervention. So last question, and I love this question too. Are there free monitoring tools for PostgreSQL, that one could leverage? And the answer is yes. There are many. It's an open source tool. There are a lot of open source options. However, they all often come with specifics about why that creator made that monitoring tool. All of them will rely on things like pgstat statements that I just showed you, or other views that are currently installed in your Postgres database, pgstat tuple for looking at row and index statistics. There are things that will allow you to look at CPU and things like that. So as long as you have those extensions available or that information available, you can look at PG. I'll be honest, I'm not going to throw a bunch out there because there's a lot of them. And even in the last couple of months, there have been some that have come out. I would say keep your eye out. There might be something that Redgate is looking to do as a community tool. I literally can't say more than that, simply because it's something, we're just kind of in the discussion stages, but we see a need and we'd like to be a help there. But there are other open source tools that you can look at. A lot of them are based on Grafana. And so as long as you can install Grafana or have access to it, you can look at them. Some other good tools are for paid. SQL Monitor does now support Postgres. So if you happen to be a Redgate user and you have Postgres instances, we can monitor those for you. Really, the team has done a great job there. Some other community tools you can look at. PG Analyze might be a good start for just a low-level entry point to Postgres. Some of those areas as well. So hopefully that's at least helpful. I'm sorry that I'm not going to give you names at the moment, mostly because I don't have a browser open and I just need that memory of names to make sure I get the right ones for you. But shouldn't be too hard to find out. If you want, please reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk to you about options you might be finding, ways that we could help you find a tool that suits your need right now. Those were excellent questions. I hope this has been a helpful view into how you can just start with Postgres, just as a beginning. Please feel free to connect with us at Redgate. Please reach out to me through social or through LinkedIn, whatever that might look like. I'm happy to have more of a conversation, and I really appreciate your time today. Have a great week, a good weekend coming up, and we hope to see you both at the next webinar with Grant. Please consider Past Data Summit. There's just so much really good content coming. I'm so excited for the opportunity, and I think you will be too if you can join us. It's been a pleasure.